Before you judge me for the oath I am about to break, you must understand one thing. A dead man was breathing, and it was my job to make the world forget. My name no longer matters. It was scrubbed from the ledgers the day I walked away. For 40 years I was a keeper of the doctrine, an inquisitor for the Holy See. My hands have held secrets that would shatter nations and crumble the faith of the most devout. I have interrogated men who claimed to speak with angels and others who swore they bargained with demons. I thought I had seen the absolute limits of human heresy and divine mystery. I was wrong. The truth is infinitely stranger and far more dangerous. It began in the cold, biting winter of 1983. The file that landed on my desk was deceptively thin, bound in simple black leather with no title, only a codex number that designated it as a matter of the highest urgency and secrecy. Inside, the paper was crisp, the ink precise. Just 2 words were stamped on the cover page, a phrase I had never seen in 4 decades of service, a concept so profoundly heretical it was thought to be impossible. Resurrectio non permissa, unsanctioned resurrection. The accused was a name unknown to us, Dr. Alistair Finch. He was not a priest, not a member of any occult order we monitored. He was a ghost, a reclusive English historian and linguist who had spent the better part of his life buried in the dust of Egypt. His specialty was obscure Coptic and pre-dynastic texts, the forgotten dialects of men who worshipped the sun and mapped the afterlife thousands of years before the star of Bethlehem ever rose. He was a man of books and silence, of words that had turned to dust, until it seemed he had made them flesh again. The report, heavily redacted and written with a palpable sense of terror by the local bishop, was brief. Dr. Finch had been discovered in a recently unearthed, sealed chamber within the ancient monastery of St. Macarius the Great in the Cetus Desert. He was not alone. He was standing over the body of a colleague, another scholar named Dr. Evelyn Reed, who had been officially pronounced dead from a sudden cardiac arrest 2 days prior. The body had been sealed in the chamber pending transport. But when the monks unsealed the door, they found Finch standing there, his hand resting on the woman's forehead. And she was breathing, not gasping, not struggling, but breathing with a slow, rhythmic calm, her eyes wide open and aware. The report stated the local authorities were in a state of panic, that the event was being suppressed with extreme prejudice, and that Finch was being rendered to Rome immediately. I was assigned to lead the interrogation. In the cold, sterile rooms beneath the palace of the Holy Office, I prepared myself. I expected a charlatan, some clever fraud using a hidden drug or a psychological trick. Or, perhaps, a madman, a fanatic who had stumbled upon some devilish rite in one of his cursed books. I was prepared for lies, for screaming, for the raving of a possessed soul. I was not prepared for the man who was led into the room. Alistair Finch was a small, unassuming man in his late 60s, with kind eyes and hands stained with the ink of 100 dead languages. He wasn't in chains. He walked with a quiet dignity, his gaze sweeping over the room, the cold stone walls, the single iron chair, the crucifix I had deliberately placed on the table between us, with a detached curiosity, as if he were cataloging artifacts in a museum. He sat down without being told, folded his hands, and waited. He wasn't afraid. He was patient. "Do you know why you are here, Doctor?" I began, my voice the cold, authoritative instrument I had honed over decades. He met my gaze, and a faint, sad smile touched his lips. "I am here because you fear what you have forgotten." The answer disarmed me. I pressed on, laying out the accusation, the impossible report, the dead woman who was now alive. I expected denial or perhaps a boastful confession. I received neither. "I did not resurrect her," he said, his voice soft but resonant, filling the dead air of the chamber. "The concept is a theological misunderstanding. Life is a frequency, a song." Dr. Reed's song had merely paused. I simply reminded her of the words of awakening. He spoke of a language, a vibrational tongue, that predated prayer. A series of sounds that didn't petition a higher power for a miracle, but instructed the very fabric of reality to correct itself. He called it the echo of creation. It was the most profound blasphemy I had ever heard, a direct assault on the omnipotence of God himself. Yet he did not speak with the wildfire of a heretic. He spoke with the calm, unwavering certainty of a physicist explaining the laws of gravity. He looked at me, a man whose entire life was dedicated to a single, immutable truth, and he told me that our holy books, our rituals, our Christ himself, were merely an edited, redacted translation of a power so immense, the Church had no choice but to hide it. And in his unervingly calm eyes, I saw for the first time not madness, but a truth that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The Vatican is built on the bones of martyrs and the weight of secrets, but I learned that some secrets refuse to be contained by stone. The trial of Alistair Finch was never held in a formal courtroom. Such matters, the ones that threaten the very marrow of the faith, are handled in places that do not officially exist. He was taken to a room deep beneath the Vatican's secret archives, a place known only by its designation in the oldest codices. The Camera Silentiae, the Chamber of Silence. It was not a courtroom, but a tomb for inconvenient truths. Dug centuries ago, it was soundproofed with thick layers of lead and packed earth. There were no windows, no vents. The air was so still and dead you could feel the pressure of it in your ears. A physical weight designed to crush a man's spirit before the interrogation even began. I had seen the chamber break a dozen men. But from the moment Finch was led inside, it felt as though the chamber itself was the one being broken. The air, normally cold and sterile, grew heavy, thick with a charge like the moments before a lightning strike. The blessed candles we used for light, specially prepared to burn without flicker or smoke, began to behave erratically. They didn't just flicker. They would dance in perfect, unnerving unison, swaying to a rhythm that did not exist, their flames bending at impossible angles as if straining to listen to a silent wind. It was unsettling, but it was only the beginning. The true horror began when the official record started to lie. Every session was recorded by two scribes, their quills scratching furiously across the parchment, their work cross-referenced and verified by me personally. But within days, the transcripts began to show anomalies. Words appeared on the page that Finch had never uttered. Entire sentences materialized in the margins, written in a spidery, archaic form of Coptic that made the scribe's hands tremble to even look at. One phrase appeared over and over, a ghost in the machine of our sacred process. The voice is the key. The stone is the lock. We changed the scribes, then the ink, then the very parchment itself. It made no difference. The record was being corrupted by an unseen hand, the very history of the trial rewriting itself moments after it occurred. The psychological toll was immediate. A young clerk, a boy from Naples named Alberto whose faith was so pure it was almost a physical shield, was tasked with archiving the tainted transcripts. After 3 days, he was found in a forgotten corridor, clawing at the stone walls, his fingernails torn and bloody. He was weeping, telling the guards he could hear whispers coming from the stones themselves. A low, melodic chanting that he said made the holy psalms feel empty and hollow. He claimed the voice was telling him secrets about the geometry of creation. He was removed, of course. The official explanation was a sudden and severe nervous breakdown. We were told he had been sent to a quiet monastery in the Alps for spiritual recovery. We never saw him again. Through it all, Finch remained an island of impossible calm. He would sit in his holding cell, a small stone room adjoining the chamber, and he would not speak for days at a time. Instead, he would hum. It was a single, low, continuous note, a frequency that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones of the building itself. You could feel it in your teeth, a deep, vibrational thrum that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the Vatican. The guards assigned to his detail had to be rotated every 4 hours. They complained of blinding headaches, of nosebleeds, of vivid, recurring dreams of walking through endless deserts of black sand under a sky with 2 suns. Soon, my own sleep became a battlefield. I, who had been trained to lock down my mind, to build walls of prayer and doctrine against the influence of the demonic, found my defenses breached. I didn't dream of deserts. I dreamed of the Chamber of Silence. But in my dreams, the stone walls were not blank. They were covered in glowing hieroglyphs made of fire, symbols that shifted and flowed like liquid light, constantly rewriting themselves. I would wake in a cold sweat, the ghost of an impossible language echoing in my mind, the meaning just beyond my grasp but the feeling of it. A sense of terrifying, infinite knowledge, clinging to me like a shroud. We were the church's scalpels, trained to recognize the devil's work in every shadow, every lie, every moment of human weakness. We knew his tricks, his scent, the subtle ways he twisted faith into pride and doubt into despair. But this was not the work of any devil I had been taught to fight. The devil tempts, he corrupts, he lies. He does not hum the foundation of a holy city to the point of breaking. He does not rewrite a sacred transcript with a language older than sin. This was something else, something older, something primordial, something the devil himself might bow to. My purpose in that chamber was to be the hammer that breaks a man's soul, to find the hairline cracks in his faith and drive a wedge of holy terror into them until he shattered into confession. But with Alistair Finch, I found myself holding a hammer made of glass while he wielded a reality forged from diamond. Every tool I possessed, every weapon in the sacred arsenal of the Holy Inquisition, was not only useless against him, it was turned back against me with a calm, surgical precision that left my own soul bleeding. I began with Scripture, the living Word of God, the bedrock of our truth. I quoted Genesis. In the beginning, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. I leaned forward, my voice a low growl of authority. God spoke, Doctor. He did not hum. His was the one true voice of creation. Finch listened with the placid attention of a teacher hearing a student's flawed recitation. An elegant translation, he conceded, his voice devoid of sarcasm. But a translation nonetheless. You are reading the sheet music, Father, and assuming it is the symphony. The word you read as said, in the original Hebrew, Wayomer, is a shadow, a placeholder for a concept your language has no word for. It describes a vibratory utterance, a shaping of intent into resonant frequency. God did not speak. He sang the universe into existence. He dismantled my every argument. When I quoted the Church Fathers, he would gently point out the passages where they themselves admitted to borrowing from pre-Christian pagan philosophy. When I cited the edicts of the great councils that defined our dogma, he would ask, and what texts were burned just before those councils convened? What knowledge had to be declared heresy to make your truth the only one? He spoke of the Library of Alexandria not as a tragic loss of history, but as a deliberate act of theological cleansing, an erasure of humanity's spiritual birthright. The interrogation became a lecture, and I was the unwilling student. Your entire faith, he explained one afternoon, the only light in the room catching the dust motes dancing around his head like a profane halo, is a pale reflection, a distorted echo of a far older and more potent science. You have sacraments, they had activations. You have prayer, they had instruction. You beg for miracles from a distant, paternal God. The ancient priests understood that the divine is a latent force within creation itself, waiting for the correct, phonetic key to unlock it. He claimed that the power Christ wielded, healing the sick, calming the storms, even raising the dead, was not a unique miracle granted by a heavenly Father. It was, he insisted, the mastery of this echo of creation, a science he had learned during his lost years, likely from the remnants of priestly orders in Egypt or the East. The miracles were not the point, Finch whispered, leaning forward for the first time, his intensity a palpable force. They were demonstrations, a lesson plan. He was trying to teach humanity how to use the user's manual for reality that it had long forgotten. And for that, your predecessors killed him. I felt a cold dread seeping into my bones. This was no longer an interrogation. It was a vivisection of my entire world. He saw the doubt in my eyes, the cracks forming in my 4 decades of certainty. You think I speak in metaphors, he said softly. Look outside this room. Look at the very heart of your church. In the center of St. Peter's Square stands a single, massive Egyptian obelisk. Why is it there? Your historians call it a trophy, a symbol of paganism's defeat. A lie of convenience. His eyes bored into mine. That obelisk is a machine. It is an antenna, carved from stone sourced from a specific quarry for its crystalline resonant properties, and placed with geometric precision upon a nexus of telluric energies. It was designed to gather, focus, and amplify the echo, but it is also a suppressor. It is tuned, if you will, to the frequency of petitionary prayer, the prayer of begging, of asking, while simultaneously dampening the frequencies of command. Your most sacred space is a psychic cage, designed to ensure humanity never remembers its own voice. My own voice was gone. I sat there, the Inquisitor, the keeper of the doctrine, and I had no response. The crucifix on the table between us felt like a child's toy. The weight of my office, my robes, my entire life, felt like a costume. He had not confessed to heresy. He had accused my entire world of being one. He saw my unraveling and concluded his lesson for the day with a quiet, devastating question. He did not ask if I believed in God. He asked something far more dangerous. "Father," he said, his voice full of a terrible, gentle pity, "have you ever truly felt your own prayers work?" My questions were over. My superiors had heard enough. When a disease of the soul does not respond to reason, the Church has only one final, brutal instrument: fire and prayer. The prefect of the congregation himself, a man whose face seemed carved from ancient ice, reviewed my reports. His verdict was delivered without deliberation. A cold, hard stone of a command dropped into the chaos of our investigation. Alistair Finch was not a heretic to be understood, but a vessel to be cleansed. The interrogation was over. The exorcism was about to begin. They didn't choose a chapel. Such a place could be desecrated. They chose the Chamber of Silence itself, intending to turn the Tomb of Secrets into a battlefield. 2 of the Church's most senior exorcists were summoned from a secluded monastery in the Apennine Mountains. They were old men, brothers, with eyes that had seen the true face of darkness and had not flinched. They did not carry Bibles. Their hands were clasped around worn, wooden crucifixes said to contain splinters from the true cross. They brought holy water sourced from the Jordan River itself and a small, lead-lined box containing a single, thorn-like relic I was not permitted to identify. They were the Church's living weapons, and they moved with the grim certainty of executioners. They brought Finch to the center of the chamber, this time in heavy iron chains blessed by a cardinal. The moment the exorcists entered, the very air in the room changed. It grew thin and sharp, so cold that our breath plumed in the near darkness. The last of the candles we had placed around the room guttered and died in unison, as if a great, silent lung had exhaled, plunging us into a gloom lit only by the faint, red glow of the coals in the exorcist's censers. The sweet, cloying smell of sanctified incense filled the chamber, a desperate attempt to impose holiness on a place that now felt profoundly alien. The rite began. The brothers' voices rose in the ancient, commanding Latin of the Rituale Romanum, a language forged in 1,000 battles against the demonic. They commanded, they rebuked, they abjured. The words that had cast demons from the possessed for centuries echoed off the stone. A tidal wave of sacred power meant to shatter Finch's soul. But he remained silent, his head bowed, the chains hanging heavy on his small frame. He seemed to be listening to something else entirely. Then, as the exorcists reached the crescendo of the rite, the moment they invoked the holiest names and commanded the entity to depart, Finch slowly lifted his head. He looked at the 2 old men, their faces contorted in righteous fury, and there was no fear in his eyes. There was no hatred. There was only a vast, soul-crushing pity. He opened his mouth. He spoke only one word. It was not a word from any human language. It was a sound that should not exist. It was not something you heard with your ears. You felt it in the architecture of your own bones. It was the sound of a crystal the size of a mountain shattering in absolute silence. It was the sound of a star being born and dying in the same instant. It was a note of pure, geometric, and terrible power that vibrated through the stone, through our bodies, through the very essence of the moment. It did not feel demonic or holy, felt factual, like a law of physics being stated for the first and final time. The 2 exorcists recoiled as if they had been physically struck by a thunderbolt. The elder of the 2, a man who had faced down murderers and madmen, simply crumpled, a thin trickle of blood running from each of his eyes as he fell to the floor. The other screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure, unadulterated terror, clutching his head before he too collapsed, his body convulsing. The heavy iron chains on Finch's wrists and ankles did not break. They did not unlock. They simply dissolved, turning to a shower of fine, reddish-brown rust and dust that settled silently on the floor. And then, there was silence. But it was not an absence of noise. It was a presence. A crushing, absolute void that pressed in from all sides, heavier than stone, colder than the grave. A silence so profound it was louder than any scream. Alistair Finch was gone. He had not run. The door had not opened. He had simply vanished from a sealed room 300 feet beneath the ground. The only thing that remained was a fine layer of pale, golden sand settled on the seat of the iron chair where he had been sitting. The official report, the one the prefect placed in front of me and ordered me to sign, states that the heretic Alistair Finch suffered a fatal aneurysm during the final rites. It says his body was immediately incinerated according to sacred protocols for contaminated remains. It says the 2 exorcists were honorably retired to a sanatorium for spiritual recuperation. It says the case is closed. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that in that moment, in that chamber, we were not the ones in control. We were children playing with matches in the shadow of a star. And for one terrifying instant, it had opened its eyes. They can bury a body, and they can burn a file, but they cannot command a man to forget what he has seen. The Vatican is a fortress built of secrets, but its most formidable walls are not stone. They are the silent, signed confessions of men like me. The report I was forced to sign was a masterpiece of institutional fiction. It stated that the heretic Alistair Finch had expired from natural causes, that the 2 traumatized exorcists had been honorably retired, and that the matter was permanently sealed under a codex so restrictive it was a sin to even speak its name. I signed it. I dipped the quill in the prefect's inkwell, and with my own hand, I made the truth disappear. In that moment, my life as an inquisitor ended. I was no longer a keeper of the faith. I was a curator of a lie, and the echo of that impossible word Finch had spoken was now my silent, eternal cellmate. My faith was a corpse, but my mission had never been clearer. I could no longer serve the institution, but I could haunt its memory. I feigned a crisis of spirit, a burnout from the Finch affair, and requested a transfer. Not to a parish, not to a monastery, but to the archives. The request was granted. They thought I was a loyal, broken soldier seeking quiet refuge. They had no idea they were letting a ghost loose in their graveyard. For the next 20 years, the Vatican secret archives were my purgatory and my obsession. I was a shadow moving through miles of shelves, breathing in the dust of forgotten popes and condemned kings. By day, I was a diligent, faceless archivist. By night, I was a heretic, a spiritual archaeologist digging for the origins of the sound that had unmade my world. I used my clearance to access the forbidden sections, the inferno, where the books deemed too dangerous to exist were kept chained to the shelves. I found fragments, whispers scattered across centuries, all pointing back to the same terrible, magnificent truth. I found a letter from a 17th-century Jesuit missionary in Egypt, written in a desperate, shaky hand. He described a secret priestly sect living in the deep desert who did not pray to their gods but spoke to the landscape, claiming to use the old voice to make the oases bloom. His next letter requested an immediate transfer, stating his faith was in peril from a truth that feels older than God. There were no further letters. I found a 4th-century Coptic gospel, rejected during the Council of Nicaea and marked for destruction. In its margins, an unknown scribe had written in Greek, "They burn our words but cannot burn the voice. It lives in the stone and the water." Christ was a master of the voice, but they have made him a singer of their songs. The page had been sliced with a knife, but the words were still there. I cross-referenced astronomical charts made by a Jesuit priest in the 1600s with maps of ancient Egyptian temples. I found alignments, geometric patterns that matched what Finch had said. Temples built not just for worship, but as resonant chambers, designed to amplify sound, to amplify the echo. He wasn't mad. He was a historian who had found the source code. Over 2 decades, the mosaic came together. It was a conspiracy not of men, but of an idea, an institution across millennia. A conspiracy to sever humanity from its own innate divinity. Finch had called it the echo of creation. But in the oldest texts, the ones that had escaped the burnings, it had another name, the language of light. A science of the soul based on the principle that the universe is conscious and that certain vibrational utterances, words, sounds, thoughts, could directly interface with it. This was the magic of the Egyptian priests, the power of the Gnostic mystics, and the true, suppressed teaching of Christ. It was the knowledge that humanity was not fallen and in need of salvation through an institution, but divine and in need only of remembering. One night I found my final piece. It was the original, unredacted report on the acquisition of the Egyptian obelisk that stands in St. Peter's Square. Buried deep in the logistical details was a single, terrifying addendum from the chief engineer. He wrote that when they excavated the foundation for its new position, they found a chamber beneath the earth, and in that chamber, a sound that undid the silence. He recommended the chamber be filled with lead and consecrated ground, to ensure the old voice does not answer the new. That was enough. I knew I could not expose the truth from within. To do so would be to vanish, another quiet footnote in a redacted file. So I became a thief. Over 3 nights, I used my knowledge of the archives to steal the key pieces of my research: the Jesuit's letter, a photograph of the Gnostic Gospels margin, and the engineer's report on the obelisk. These were my proofs, my relics of a faith more real than anything the Vatican preached. With them tucked into a false-bottomed satchel, I walked out of the Vatican grounds for the last time, a heretic, a traitor, a ghost finally escaping his tomb, carrying with me the faint but undying echo of the truth. You have listened to my confession, and now the silence that has been my companion for 20 years is yours to share. Do not mistake this for the ramblings of a bitter old man. I am not bitter. I am terrified, because the trial of Alistair Finch never truly ended. It merely escaped the confines of that stone chamber and is now taking place in the quiet corners of our world, in the hearts of anyone who has ever felt that their prayers were spoken into a void. I am no longer a priest, no longer an inquisitor. I am a keeper of an echo, a librarian of a single, impossible sound. I live now in a small, quiet place, a cottage by a gray sea, surrounded by the books and manuscripts that would have me burned at the stake. The pages I stole from the archives are my only congregation. The Jesuits' desperate letter, the Gnostics' defiant scrawl, the engineer's terrified warning. They are my liturgy. They are the fragmented gospels of a truth so profound that the most powerful institution on earth has dedicated 2 millennia to making us forget it. I read them every night, not to study, but to remember, to keep the memory of Alistair Finch and the thing he awoke in that chamber from fading into the comfortable lies of history. He was not the monster. The monster is the cage they have built around our souls. A cage constructed of dogma and ritual, designed to make us forget that we were ever born with wings. The great, secret fear of the Vatican, the fear that drove them to burn libraries, to twist scripture, to bury their own saints' true histories, and to silence men like Finch, was never about the devil. It was about you. It was about the terrifying, uncontrollable, divine power that sleeps within every human soul. Finch did not perform a miracle. He simply spoke a language the universe has never forgotten, a language we were all meant to speak, a language of direct creation. They have taught us to beg, to kneel and petition a distant king on a heavenly throne. They have given us prayer, which is the language of supplicants. But they have hidden from us the language of light, which is the language of co-creators. If you can heal with a word, who needs a relic? If you can find the divine by turning inward, who needs a priest to mediate? If your own soul contains the echo of creation, what power does an institution built on mediating that power truly have? That is the heresy. Not that God doesn't exist, but that the kingdom of heaven is not a place you go to when you die. It is a state of consciousness you have been conditioned to forget how to access. So I ask you, now that you have heard my story, to listen. Not to me, but to the silences in your own life. Have you ever had a moment of profound intuition, a gut feeling that saved you from harm? Have you ever had a thought, an idea, that seemed to arrive fully formed from nowhere, a perfect crystalline solution to an impossible problem? Have you ever spoken a word of comfort to someone in pain and felt a warmth pass through you, a feeling of rightness that was more than just empathy? That is it. That is the echo. Faint, distorted, buried under lifetimes of noise and doubt, but it is there. They have tried to drown it out with choirs and sermons and the rattling of collection plates, but they cannot erase it. It is in our spiritual DNA. The trial of Alistair Finch was the Vatican's panicked attempt to silence a man who had not just rediscovered that echo but had learned to amplify it. They did not fear him. They fear the possibility that he was not an anomaly but a prototype. They fear that what one man could relearn, humanity could remember. They fear a world where we no longer look to the sky for salvation, but to the divinity sleeping within us. I am old now and my time is short. Soon, I will be nothing but another forgotten file in God's great archive. But I had to tell someone. I had to pass on this warning. Do not believe that the Inquisitors are gone. They are still here. They wear suits and lab coats now, monitoring the whispers of the world not for heresy, but for signs of this great remembering. They are listening, and so must you. Listen. In the silence between your heartbeats, in the quiet moments before sleep, listen for that ancient, impossible sound. The echo of the word that was spoken in the beginning. The word that Alistair Finch spoke in the end. It is your birthright, and it is the one thing they pray you never, ever hear again.